Welcome to the NHL Wraparound podcast featuring Neil Smith, President General Manager of the 1994 Stanley Cup Champion New York Rangers, and longtime ESPN NHL veteran Vic Morren. Together, they share no-nonsense opinions on news and issues around the National Hockey League. Whether you're a casual or diehard fan, each episode of NHL Wraparound will leave you more informed. Now, here's your hosts, Neil and Vic.
Welcome to the final NHL Wraparound show of 2024. Vic Morren along with Neil Smith, and very shortly we are going to be joined by Max Bultman from The Athletic to talk some Detroit Red Wings and their coaching change that took place right after Christmas. But first, three things that you need to pay attention to. Hey, Neil, you ever hear of Jakub Dobes?
I had not heard of him. This young man, big guy, 6'5", played goal for the Montreal Canadiens and goes into Florida and shuts out the defending Stanley Cup champs and looked really good doing it.
Became only the seventh goaltender in history to defeat the defending champions in his NHL debut, making 34 saves. And while we're at it, on Sunday evening, Sam Montembeault led the win against Tampa Bay. So the Canadiens now have won 5 out of 6.
Yeah, which is amazing. And you got to give Marty St. Louis a lot of credit because he's got this team firing on all cylinders. We didn't even know they had this many cylinders, let alone firing on all of them. But they're playing really well, and they're playing well in both ends of the ice. So good on Montreal. We talked about Detroit all the time, and Ottawa all the time, and a little bit about Buffalo. But Montreal deserves some love right now too, because they're as in that group of teams that are on the bubble and trying to make their way up into playoff contention. Montreal might be playing the best of all of them right now, although we do know that Ottawa's making a good stab at it.
They have actually pushed their way into 6th in the wild card race. The second thing that you need to pay attention to, Alexander Ovechkin returned to the Capitals lineup over the weekend. He scores number 869 in his career into an empty net in Toronto. And then on Sunday evening in Detroit, he scores number 870 despite missing 16 games with that fractured fibula. He is still projected to score 56 goals this season. And if that holds, he would end up with 910 by the end of the season. And all of a sudden, we're not going to be talking Gretzky. We're going to be talking 1,000.
Yeah, no, he's amazing. This little small sample size of this comeback that he's having since the broken leg. But I thought that Washington would beat Detroit on Sunday because Washington is playing really well. Detroit is not. And actually, when Ovechkin got that one-timer goal, it was 2-0 for Detroit. And when Ovechkin got that, you went, oh, here they come. But 30 seconds later, Detroit put another puck into the Washington net, and that seemed to seal the fate, albeit still in the first period. But Ovechkin's goal was vintage Ovechkin, where he came down the side and just one-timed it into the net, and still gets as excited about scoring this goal as he did when he was a rookie.
The enthusiasm is, I think, rubs off on just every single player on the Caps team, that when they see their big stud doing his stuff, they can't help to just get caught up in that enthusiasm. The third thing that you need to pay attention to, second night of back-to-back games. So we saw that Florida and Tampa Bay right before Christmas locked horns. That was nasty. Boston and Columbus played on consecutive nights, and the second game was certainly more edgy than the first night. How about Carolina and Jersey going at it on Friday and Saturday? So in the second game of these back-to-backs, Timo Meier with a knee-on-knee hit against Marty Necas. Necas is not putting any weight on one leg. It looks like he's really severely injured. A game misconduct is given to Myers. And then, amazingly, Necas manages to return to the game. And that was certainly not lost on Devils coach Sheldon Keefe, who was, I think, rightfully ticked off that his player gets ejected and the guy that's supposedly injured comes right back and plays.
And that's going to happen sometimes, right? Because there's a fear when you see those hits that they could have blown a knee out. And I'm sure the players is in fear of that as well. I don't think it was any kind of faking on Nature's part. I think it was just genuine fear that is he injured or is he not? And then he gets to come back. And you know what? Like when you do that, it's the referee's call is the right call because whether he comes back or not is really nothing to do with the infraction that you make when your leg is out like that, because it is a very dangerous play. The other comment I'd make is that Carolina and New Jersey both fighting for first place in the Metro Division. And I think Carolina wants to prove that they can play rough and tumble, and so does New Jersey. So it was a great home and home. And as you said, there were several of them going on this past weekend.
And the teams did split the home and home series, but I do think that with the amount of skirmishes and just a lot of pushing and shoving after whistles after that event had taken place, that this is something to watch as these two teams head towards the second half of the season. And it is now my pleasure to welcome in the beat writer for the Detroit Red Wings for The Athletic, Max Bultman. Max, welcome to NHL Wraparound.
Hey, my pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me.
So is it safe to say that the third period that we saw against Toronto on Friday and the win against Washington on Sunday is somewhat of the blueprint for what Todd McLellan, the new head coach of the Red Wings, is looking for?
Yeah, I think so. I think his early emphases when he got in were nothing hugely schematic. It was play faster, play harder, and play a little bit smarter. And then he obviously wanted to raise kind of the energy level of the team. And I think those are probably if you were to do a blueprint of what went right for the Red Wings over their last really 4 periods, to your point, but especially in the Washington game, it's pretty much that. So yes, I think that's what he's going for. And I do think you saw a big bump in that Washington game, maybe not as much in the Toronto game. And I don't know how much of that you attribute to, he comes in at morning skate and they get all of, 15, 20 minutes of meaningful time on the ice with him before that first game. But certainly in the Washington game, I think you saw that kind of typical new coach bump that we tend to see when changes get made.
I thought it said something also that they got out to the big start. They were up 4-1. Washington started to make a push. And even though they bent a little, they generally defended pretty well and were able to close that game. So that's certainly an encouraging sign for this team going forward.
It is. I mean, obviously, anytime you can start a game up 4-1 after one, you're in a really good spot. That's honestly probably a hard lead to blow at that point, but they did well to protect it. And, Washington did push. And I'm always kind of careful to not overreact too much to the result. Washington had chances there, and this could have ended up as a 4-3 game that got a little sweaty. And maybe we're talking a little bit differently about it in that case. But it's as for all teams under new coaches, there's going to be a learning phase. There's going to be a span of this where they're figuring each other out. And I think to have this kind of performance in the first real game of that, maybe second game of that, is an encouraging sign that the message is taking root in kind of inside of the locker room and inside of all their heads.
Yeah, Max, I've read your last 2 articles and they've both been great. The one that Yzerman needs to do more than just change the coach. And then this morning, the 5 points you made about last night's game, I thought it was really good. Excuse me. Last year they got eliminated on the last night of the season. They hung in there the whole year. Stevie, I call him Stevie because, I was part of drafting him, so I still see him as that 18-year-old. But Stevie did a great job in Tampa Bay, obviously. And then when he came back to Detroit and they decided to switch from Jeff Blashill to a new coach, he went back to people that he knew in Derek Lalonde, who'd been the assistant coach to John Cooper during those fabulous days that Tampa had just had in the indoor games, in the bubble games. And winning those 2 cups. So last year goes good. Everybody's optimistic, including, I think, Vic and me, about the Red Wings over the summer. And then this season starts and it doesn't go at all the way anybody expected. What was the first signs that things weren't going to be going in the right direction under Derek Lalonde?
Well, I'd actually take it back to like July in the offseason here. And that's when, they knew they had some big contracts coming up. Seider and Raymond, those are cornerstone contracts. You can't mess around with those. You got to have your room to do those deals. But in order to make sure they had the kind of space they needed to do those, they had to let Shane Gostisbehere walk in free agency. They had to trade away Jake Wallman. They had to clear space on the blue end. Wallman's the guy they chose to trade to do it. They had to trade Robbie Fabry away, and they had to let David Perron walk away in free agency and Daniel Sprong. And if you total that up, I think that's north of like 70 goals that I just rattled off that walked out the door one way or another. And it's some of their most important emotional leaders. Perron in particular, I think, was probably their most important vocal leader. Larkin's their captain. He's the heartbeat. He's the engine. But if you go in that locker room, the talker was Perron. And I think when you had that kind of turnover, it didn't leave him with a whole lot of space to replace, because most of that money is just going to keeping guys they already had in that room. And so they go get a Tarasenko to replace some of the offense, like mainly from Perron. And there's a possibility he could have had more offense when you look at Tarasenko's track record. They replaced Gostisbehere with Erik Gustafsson, who I think has a similar profile, maybe not quite the high end that Gostisbehere has shown. It was really, to me at the time, a question of, is this going to be enough to replace everything that just walked out the door, to just tread water? And in training camp, there were signs that I thought maybe. Simon Edvinsson was a full-timer now, and he looked really good. Patrick Kane, I thought, had a little bit of pop in the training camp in the fall. And I thought, okay, this is going to have to be their path. It's going to have to be internal improvement. It just didn't materialize. Right on opening night, they got booed off home ice to a Pittsburgh Penguins team that has not been particularly good this year. And you were like, this does look like it might be an issue. It was going to lean a lot on internal improvement. And you saw some from the right guys, frankly. Edvinsson was probably one of their most important players coming into the year. If you'd asked me for X factors, he'd have probably been the first guy I said. And he looked good. And it just wasn't enough to replace everything that walked out the door. They went from a deep team that had scoring on all four lines to a team that relied almost entirely on its first forward line and its first defense pair to do just about everything. And I think that was the story of their first 3 months of the season.
So do you think that Derek Lalonde then was a victim of the cap era and just the fact that you have to make certain moves for money now that you didn't have to make in the past, and that it's not really fair to judge this season and Derek Lalonde in the way we might, because he was dealing with a team that was inferior to the team that he had the year before. So it wasn't really him. Or am I getting that wrong? Because you're there in the locker room with these guys. I don't know Derek Lalonde at all, but I just wonder your take.
I think there is some truth to it. It's always nuance, right? Like I think a big part of this is the roster was worse from last year. That's my opinion. Steve Yzerman might disagree. That's my feeling was that they came in and it was going to be harder to get to the same place they had just been the year before. On day one, that was my feeling. At the same time, I don't think they had the same spark to them either. And I don't think that's all a roster thing, right? I think Derek Lalonde is a very smart coach. And you saw the success that he was able to have on those Tampa Bay staffs that you alluded to. I think he was a really smart guy. He was also a first-time head guy. And as you know, Neil, obviously, there's always a difference when a coach goes from an assistant to that head job and what it takes to do that job to the fullest. And I hope that Derek gets another chance in the NHL to build on what he learned in his time in Detroit, because I do think he's a really good hockey mind. I think he's got a lot of really good instincts about the game and thoughts about the game and how to win at the highest level. He was, I think, a part of the reason that Tampa team took the next step. It was right when he got there that they went from this really good, talented team to a great winning hockey team. I think those lessons set in deep for him. I think the challenge of taking a team that was not yet good and ready to be great, not yet good, trying to be good, rather than a team that's good trying to be great, was a new challenge for him. There was a different situation, at least at the NHL level, than what he had before. And so that's what I think with McLellan coming in, is you get a guy with 1,100 games of NHL experience who's seen so many different situations. There's not going to be anything that really surprises him that he sees in a dressing room, in a practice, in a game, nothing that he's not used to. He'll have seen it somewhere. And I think that's the advantage that Todd McLellan now has, that Derek Lalonde had an uphill battle for. It doesn't absolve Derek of any responsibility. He was the head coach, right? Like they trusted him to be able to adapt to those things. And ultimately he wasn't able to do it. But I do have a lot of sympathy for him, because I do think his job got harder this year. And there was, he maybe in a future scenario, we'll be better equipped to manage that. But this time around, it just didn't work out.
Max, in a piece that you wrote right after Christmas, you had said, this coaching move to bring in McLellan and replace Lalonde, it's not the only thing that Yzerman should be doing right now. There are other moves that should be forthcoming. You also noted that, Mark Howe, who was the director of pro scouting when he retired in 2021, hasn't been replaced in 3 years. So as this club starts to now build itself forward, create its new identity, what pieces do you see Yzerman needing to fill in order for the team to take the next step that we kind of expected at the start of the year?
Yeah. And I asked Steve Yzerman about that at the post end of season press conference last year. I asked about the pro scouting, director of pro scouting title. And he said, we may not have anyone of that title, but we're happy with where we're at. So maybe they are content with the staffing decisions there. My feeling is when you look at what they've had in free agency over the last few years, and I know it's so easy with hindsight. I am not trying to say, you should have just signed every of the guys who turned out the best from every free agent class. That'd be totally unfair. But you look at the aggregate of their results, they haven't had enough success in free agency. And they've had a couple of nice trades. I think the DeBrincat trade was a good trade. I think some of the pieces that they brought in free agency can work, but there's also some redundancy to them, right? You get Andrew Kopp and JT Compher. I don't know if you need both of those guys. You get Justin Hall and Jeff Petrie. Those guys ideally would probably both play the same role, the third pair D on the right side. And you got them both. And it ended up in Justin Hall sitting most of last season. And now they're both in the lineup. It's a second and third pair, but you probably overslot Petrie a little bit by doing that, right? You ask a little much of him in that way, in my opinion. And so I look at it and I don't want to, hindsight this whole thing, but I just wonder, is there anything in their process that you can look at there and say, well, I wonder if this could help them in free agency? And the director of pro scouting title was something that jumped out to me. Maybe they do feel fine about how that department is structured without that title. But for me on the outside, that's one thing I look at and say, well, this is a guy who left that was really influential. And it was right around the same time Pat Verbeek left too, guys. Pat Verbeek, I think, was a really important voice in that front office. And they did replace him, but they replaced him by promoting internally. And so you don't get any new voices to replace the old voices. You just kind of elevate voices you already had, which can be okay. It's good for development of front office talent, but you don't get that new perspective in there. So that's one thing I think. Can you round out the front office in some way, whether it's in that exact title that I mentioned or in something else? I wonder, can you get some new perspectives into your brain trust? I also just see some on ice things that I think they can fix. I think they were trying to find a number 2 center in both Kopp and Compher, and both probably end up slotting a little bit better as either a third line center or a middle 6 wing, right? Like that's probably more their ideal role. They clearly need a second pair upgrade on defense because you have Edvinsson and Seider, and you don't have a whole lot else that you really trust in that kind of capacity. I think they trust Ben Sherratt, and he's up and down sometimes, but I do think there's reason to trust him. It's just that it hasn't gone as well as you'd hope. And he's got a great career. His results haven't been what you'd want him to be. So I think you probably need to upgrade at least one guy on the second pair of the defense. And I think you probably want a real upgrade on the second line. Ideally it's center, but if it's a wing, it's a wing. You just need more offense from beyond your first line. And so those 3 things, a top 6 forward, a top 4 D, and a little more new perspective, I think in the decision-making, particularly when it comes to player personnel, are 3 things that I see as needs for this team. And I know that's probably easier said than done. I bet 20 teams in the league want an upgrade on the second pair and in the top 6. But that's what I see.
Where's the head of the captain right now, Dylan Larkin? Because there was probably an unfounded rumor that made its way through X a little while ago that he was unhappy in Detroit. And, unless this team has a remarkable turnaround, and there's still 4 games under 500 right now, and they're going to have to jump 7 teams in order to get into a wild card. You've got 3-point games. I mean, the math doesn't really work very well. And this is going to be the 9th straight year that he's going to be missing the postseason. He had 5 playoff games as a rookie in 2015, 2016. But where do you think his head is at now that the coaching change has been made? There appears to be maybe a little bit more positive direction here. And will he be able to continue to lead this team in the way that he has grown into a leader over the past several seasons?
Yeah. So first of all, the tweet that you're referencing was like the guy even admitted it. He was a Senators fan that was trying to make a point about the Brady Tkachuk rumors. He was trying to show, hey, anyone can start this kind of stuff about somebody's captain. So that one wasn't real. But I do think Dylan Larkin really wants to win. And I think he is a guy who burns to win. And I think this has been really hard on him to go as long as he has without the playoffs. Todd McLellan even commented on it in his opening press conference that he's watched some of Dylan's interviews and felt like he can kind of see how much weight is on Dylan's shoulders and wanted to kind of take some of that off of him, whether it's himself or whether it's, other guys coming out and answering. Dylan's had 9 years of questions about why is this team not better? And for anybody, that's a lot. It's a lot having to ask those same questions for that long, let alone having to come up and find answers that people find satisfying. So I do think it's been really tough on him. And I think as much as anyone, he is ready to move into the next phases. I thought he had the best season of his career last year. And if it had ended in the playoffs, it would have been made for a really great story for him. And I have covered him for 7 years now. I think this is a guy who will elevate when it gets to playoff hockey, and they got to get him in there because he, to your point, he's 28 now, and you don't want to go too long before you give a player like that. You stumble into a number one center in the middle of the first round. You don't want to waste that kind of good fortune. And to this point in his career, they kind of have, some of it by necessity, some of it by, it just hasn't gone quick enough. So I think that is a really good point by you, Vic.
Max, I want to ask you about two Hall of Famers that you're familiar with. One is in the Hall of Fame and the other one's going to be in the Hall of Fame. The one that's going to be in the Hall of Fame is Patrick Kane. And can you tell me, where is he in his career? Because there are some people that watch Detroit play and talk about Detroit and say, Patrick Kane is just so much slower than he used to be. He's slowed down, his hips, the this, the that. I don't see Detroit enough, and I certainly don't see them live, except for once or twice against the Islanders, to make those assessments. And can you tell us, where's Patrick Kane at this point?
I do think he's slowed down. I mean, I think it was a really slow start to the first half this year. I thought he was pretty good last year. There's obviously certain things he wasn't doing coming off the hip. He doesn't really go hard into corners. You can kind of tell he's pulling up. He's avoiding contact a little bit, which is understandable for both a smaller guy and a skill guy. But what they're going to ask of him is to at least give an honest effort, a full effort. And I think Todd McLellan has liked what he's seen from Kane in that regard so far. The way he changes the game, though, at this point of his career is just relying on his brain. And he's got all world hockey sense. He's probably one of the smartest players I've ever seen, if not the smartest player I've ever seen. And he sees plays that even from up top, you don't see. That's amazing to me. Is so often we're watching from up there and we go, oh, does he see the drop pass? Oh, does he see the seam pass? Sometimes I don't see the seam pass that he sees, and that's kind of amazing. So I think he can still impact the game really positively. And in fact, at the start of this year, I wondered, hey, this might be a guy that can make Team USA for the Four Nations still, because that's how impressed I was by his camp and obviously by what I had seen last year. It was a slow start, but he's played better of late. I think he's got 6 points in his last 7, had a really nice play last night for his 1300th career point, which is just a bananas number. But he picks up a loose puck behind the net and slips it across the crease to DeBrincat. And it's just one of those, yep, that's Patrick Kane plays for you. He can do some things that really impress you. So at this point in his career, you're not going to count on him to drive you, except for perhaps on the power play. But I think he can still impact it positively, even if it is from the perimeter, because that's how well he sees the ice.
And I want to, the second guy I want to ask you about, obviously a Hall of Famer, Steve Yzerman, the general manager there. And because again, I don't know this because I'm not in Detroit, but I've thought of this many times. Is he getting a pass at all because of the fact that he's Steve Yzerman, number 19, the captain, the Stanley Cups? Whereas if it was a Vic Morren, God forbid, they wouldn't be giving him the free pass. What's the dynamic there in Detroit?
The heat has turned up quite a bit in the last year. I think when you get that close to the playoffs, I think people decide, okay, well then on this whole wait out the rebuild patience thing is done now, right? We can go win. And that hasn't happened. And I think he has gotten a lot more heat this season than in any of the previous 5. So that's starting to change. But yes, I think he gets more leeway in Detroit than anyone else would, or even than he would anywhere else. I mean, that's one of the reasons I think you make a hire like this, if you're the ownership group, is fans get antsy and they have more patience with people they know and remember and love. And I'm in Michigan, obviously. I went to the University of Michigan. I covered Michigan football for a while. And when Jim Harbaugh came back, it was kind of similar of like, okay, one reason that you go get this guy is he's going to get more buy-in from everybody, your fans, your players, everybody, than anyone else would. And I think there's a similar mechanism at work there. I do think that patience is running a little bit thinner these days. But to your point, if his name was Steve Jones, it would be a lot hotter here. And I actually think, I don't know what you think about this, Neil. I think it's a good thing that it's not gotten to that level yet. I think with both coaches and executives, we expect more sooner than is always really reasonable. And you probably do more harm than good when you put those guys on just a revolving door like that.
Is he getting less heat than that name Ken Holland would have
gotten?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And we've talked about that a lot in Detroit of like, oh, if Ken had, traded a second round pick to move Jake Wallman, this would be World War III. And people are still mad about that trade because Jake Wallman's having a great year. But yes, I think Steve does get a little more benefit of the doubt than Ken does. And I'm sure even Steve would tell you that's not really fair to Ken. I think Steve has tremendous respect for Ken, a huge mentor to him. So I do often think about that, by the end of it, it felt like, if Ken went to the wrong grocery store, people wanted to fire him for it. So it was, that is a very big difference. And I do have some sympathy for how it went at the end with Ken there too.
Well, maybe they both would get more than Jimmy D would get if Jimmy D was there. Max, it's great talking about the Red Wings. I had 7 really great years there starting in 1982 when the Ilitches first bought the team, and I went there with Jimmy Devellano, and I have great memories of starting my career or being at a certain point. So talking about the Red Wings to me is like talking about family again, albeit I've been estranged for a while, but thanks for coming on and doing this. And hopefully we can get you back here when they shock everybody and jump 7 teams and are digging at that wild card spot.
There you go. That St. Louis kind of run, right? That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I don't know if we'll ever see that again, but that would be great for Detroit and for the big winged wheel there. So anyway, Max, thanks so much for doing this. It's really been great.
Hey, my pleasure, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Max. Neil, Max Bultman from The Athletic, such a terrific guest, as all of our guests have been, just providing really unique insight from what they see that many fans and even us just quite frankly don't on a day-to-day basis.
You can't see what's really going on from the TV. And especially in a case with a beat writer like Max, he's in the locker room, he's at the practice rink, he's everywhere. So he's really getting the pulse of what's going on. We start watching when the puck gets dropped in the actual games. And although we can, make comments about certainly how teams are playing in those games, an in-depth look at any team comes best from the guys who cover that team. And certainly Max does a great job for The Athletic covering the Red Wings.
He certainly does. And just a reminder, our first NHL Wraparound show of 2025, we will incorporate New York centric, which will run for 15 consecutive Mondays through the end of the regular season, covering the New York Rangers, New York Islanders, and New Jersey Devils. And with that, Neil, it's so hard to look away from a train wreck. And this is such a big story every single time we speak that we continue to have to address the New York Rangers, who have now lost 14 out of 18 games heading into their contest in Florida on Monday. And this will be their last game of the 2024 calendar year, in which they managed to win the President's Trophy, have the most points in franchise history, have the most comebacks in franchise history, and now we're in sole possession of last place in the Metropolitan Division.
It's just hard to believe. If you had told somebody that if somebody had gone away to gosh knows where, but had come back and you said, oh, by the way, that team you follow that you thought was going to win the Stanley Cup this year, they're in last place and they don't have a captain. And you'd be like, what?
Let's take this a little bit further that in their loss against Tampa Bay coming out of the break, they lose 6-2, 2 power play goals against, 2 shorthanded goals against. Igor Shesterkin is lifted again. The team has given up 5 or more goals 11 times in their first 35 games. That only happened 17 times in the entire 82-game regular season a year ago. If this is the Big Apple, then the core is rotting. Mika Zibanejad has never been worse in his career. Chris Kreider was scratched from a game. Artemi Panarin not putting up nearly the numbers he did a year ago when he reached 120. Adam Fox doesn't look the same. Keandre Miller, who returned to the lineup, got dusted by Braden Point on the first goal. He continues to make bad decisions on reads, bad plays in his own defensive zone. And realistically, I think the only outlier on this team is Vincent Trocheck.
If the core is rotting, it's rotting because of how management has handled the team. And it's not just because I don't think you can put all the blame on the individual players. I mean, their leadership is so messed up that, I find myself on a daily basis trying to explain to people in the New York metro area, like, why is this happening? And you try to explain it from almost a psychological standpoint, and it's really hard to do. But I agree with you that Trocheck is the one guy that doesn't seem to change. He goes hard every night. But this is going to be a long, long year unless something drastic. I can't see what could possibly pull them out of this. I mean, they're not going to keep losing every game, but I don't think they're going to make the playoffs. And the people that I talk to that are Ranger fans, they've already conceded in their mind that they're not going to make the playoffs, which is bizarre when you think about it.
How long can Chris Drury wait, though? I mean, he's already moved Jacob Trouba. He's moved Capo Caco. Peter Laviolette is bench players. And you can't let this go until the end of the season and not do anything more. So going back to what I just said, how long can Chris Drury wait before either he makes a move with the coach or he starts to move pieces out?
Yeah, I don't know how he's going to move pieces out. That's a really hard thing to do because of the players all have you hamstrung with their contracts and there are no moves and there are no trades and all this different stuff.
Drury didn't really care about that when it came to Gaudreau and Trouba, though.
No, but you're not going to be doing that with these guys. That's just not going to happen. So, because you remember, just to comment on that, the reason why he was able to do that is because Gaudreau and Trouba, were drastically overpaid according to common knowledge, right? That everybody said Gaudreau makes too much money for what he brings, and everybody said that the contract that actually Trouba got from Jeff Gorton before Drury became GM, he was being drastically overpaid. And so, that's the way they pulled that move, which was the threat of waivers. In the Gaudreau's case, they did put him on waivers, to be able to rid themselves of the contracts. And I don't think you're going to be doing that with these guys. You're not going to be giving away Zibanejad, Kreider, Panarin, Fox, or Miller. You're just not. So, I would be surprised if Peter Laviolette makes it to the end of the season, not because he deserves. And I keep saying this every time we talk about coaches, because I don't think that Peter Laviolette deserves to be fired. But whether you deserve it or not, it's one of the only moves management has at their fingertips to do to try to pull the team out of this. And, we talked to Max Bultman about what went on in Detroit and about why Steve Yzerman did what he did. And everybody says Derek Lalonde is a good hockey mind. He's a good hockey coach, but he maybe didn't have the personnel that he had last year. And so he ends up getting fired. Same thing with Laviolette. He's not the one that gave away Trouba. He's not the one that gave away Capo Caco, but he may pay the price for it.
Let's make a right turn here. Talk about the Dallas Stars for a second. So they get fined for holding an optional practice on December 26th, the day after Christmas. And according to Article 16.5b of the NHL's collective bargaining agreement, December 24, 25, and 26 shall be off days for all purposes, including travel, and no club may request a player's consent to practice on such days for any reason. So there are a couple of fines that have taken place in recent years. In 2022, the Leafs were fined for traveling to St. Louis before the holiday break ended. And in 2015, the Flyers were fined for flying to Nashville earlier than they were permitted. But the question here, Neil, is Peter DeBoer knew this. And is a fine for a club really a deterrent? And could you see perhaps the language being rewritten in the next CBA to kind of make maybe more of an allowance for clubs to get back on the ice or travel sooner?
I don't see it being rewritten in the collective bargaining agreement, but I think every year you're going to end up seeing a fine for somebody who just said, you know what, we need to get in there earlier. And all the players probably voted to get in there earlier. Like with the Dallas optional practice thing, that wasn't one where they told the players, we're going to call it optional practice, but we want to see you on the ice. This was literally guys had nothing to do during those 3 days and asked, can we go on the ice? Can I go on and no coaches. And they went on the ice and Dallas got fined for it because they're not even supposed to make that ice available. So, I think you're going to see this stuff trickle in and out, but I don't think you're going to get the Players Association to say, okay, well, you can travel on the 24th or you can travel on the 26th or you can have optional skates. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to say no. Because if you give hockey players the chance, they'll give away their time off. They'll give it away.
Right. So to that end, do you see more clubs doing this? I mean, $100,000 fine in the grand scheme of business and revenues today, that's a drop in the bucket. So I could see clubs saying, screw this, we'll take the small financial hit and we'll get back on the ice and maybe create a little bit of an advantage for ourselves coming out of the break.
Yeah, I really don't see that, Vic. I think that, when you get these fines, when you do something wrong, I don't know that it's the fine as much as when you get the call from Bill Daly or Gary Bettman or Colin Campbell or whoever, and they're saying, look, you can't do that. It's right in the rules. What are you doing? Why did you do that? And you feel like an ass. I think that's worse than the fine. So I don't really see guys abusing this on purpose, but I could be wrong too. After all, we just said, if you're not in the arena, you really don't know, but I just don't see it.
Nothing like getting the call from the principal's office, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Few player notes. Canucks captain Quinn Hughes and forward Elias Pettersson will not travel to Calgary or Seattle for games this week with undisclosed injuries. Pettersson is expected to miss a week, and Hughes is week to week. Lars Eller for the Washington Capitals returned in their loss Sunday in Detroit after missing 4 games with an illness. Chris Letang missed the Penguins' second game of the back-to-back with the New York Islanders. He suffered a lower body injury on the front end of that 2-game set. But in that game on Sunday, Sidney Crosby, with his 1,034th assist, he set up Michael Bunting to pass Mario Lemieux as the franchise leader. And, that's just an unbelievable accomplishment when you considered how spectacular Mario Lemieux's numbers were.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, Vic, and I haven't done the homework on it or the math, but I would imagine the reason Sidney's able to do it is that he's just a phenomenal player. We all know that, but he doesn't miss the amount of time that Mario missed in his career with the cancer and the different things, ailments that he went through. And so Sidney has probably packed a lot more games into the years that he's been in the league than Mario did. And that's probably why he was able to get there. I doubt that his numbers on a year-by-year basis compare to Mario's, but what an accomplishment, though, for Sidney Crosby, and what a great thing for the Pittsburgh the city of Pittsburgh, really, to have had Mario Lemieux and Sidney Crosby. I mean, that's going to be a hard act to follow when the next decade comes along and we've got to have who's next. We had Mario, we have Sidney, who's next? And
considering the amount of player movement that both players have spent their entire careers in the Steel City.
Yeah. I mean, it is really amazing. But Sidney's not done yet. So we'll see. Will he finish his career entirely in the black and gold and white?
Couple of other notes. Joel Eriksson Ek returned from Minnesota's game Sunday against Ottawa, which was a loss. The Senators continuing that monstrous road trip while the World Junior Championships are being played in their building, the Canadian Tire Center. Eriksson Ek had missed 11 games with an upper body injury. And the Blackhawks, optimistic Alec Martinez and Craig Smith will be returning for the Winter Classic, which will be held on Tuesday. So speaking of which, this will be the second time that Wrigley Field is hosting the Winter Classic. Chicago beat Detroit on New Year's Day in 2009. This is the 42nd all-time outdoor game, with Detroit and Columbus playing the 43rd at Ohio Stadium in the Stadium Series on March 1st. The first ever game was the Heritage Classic between Montreal and Edmonton, which was in November of 2003. And probably the most memorable was the Winter Classic, the very first one in 2008, Pittsburgh and Buffalo, with Sidney Crosby, just mentioned, with the shootout winner in light snow against Ryan Miller. So, quick quiz here for you. Once the Blue Jackets play the Red Wings on March 1st, who are the only two current franchises that will not have played at least one game outdoors?
Well, I would say Utah.
Correct. That is correct. And that one I don't think is a surprise because obviously this is their first year in Utah, but the allure when they were in Arizona to have them play an outdoor game wasn't really sexy at that time. So you got a good check mark there. The other one, I think you would be surprised.
The other one I will, and this is just a guess, quick guess, because time is of the essence here. Winnipeg Jets.
It's actually the Florida Panthers.
Oh, okay.
So, but you know what? 500, if you're hitting that in Major League Baseball, that's pretty good. So, question for you here, though. While the outdoor games are a staple of the NHL schedule, is there still the same buzz for fans outside the participating cities? I mean, is this still appointment viewing, or is it just a made-for-TV event?
You know what? I think it's a sponsorship gathering. I think that this is for the sponsors, the NHL sponsors, of which there's tons, but I think it's for them to come and, all gather and get to an event like a type of quote unquote Super Bowl type event. And, I do think people that get to go to it, and they get tickets do get excited still about going to these games. I know I don't get excited about watching it on TV. There's very few things I would rather, there are very few things that I wouldn't rather do than watch an outdoor game on TV. But, I do know that it's exciting for the people that get tickets and the people that go and the kids that get to see it. It's great.
You can't really replicate that atmosphere. The visuals are terrific. Steve Mayer and his group just do a remarkable job, getting a feel of the local culture. You have the young kids playing on rinks on the side and bringing the game back to its roots. So there are still a lot of things that are special about it.
Yeah, there are. And as I said, for the fans and for the sponsors and for the kids, it's great. And what other sport can do something like this? I mean, it's really wonderful, and it takes it back to the heritage of the game, which was playing outdoors when the game first began. So, it's really something special for hockey. This
is the human side of the story, and Earlier, we interviewed Max Bultman from The Athletic, talking Detroit Red Wings. And Neil, this is a franchise that is really near and dear to your heart, having been owned by the Ilitch family since 1982 after purchasing the club from the Norrises, and some real important years for you in the formation of your career were spent in the Motor City.
Oh, absolutely. And I got there in 1982. Vic, I'll tell you the story was that I was with the Islanders in 81 and 82. And of course, so was Jimmy Devellano, who was the chief scout of the Islanders. So in 1982, when Mr. and Mrs. Ilitch bought the Red Wings from the Norris family, they were looking for a GM. And of course, the New York Islanders had won 3 Stanley Cups. Jimmy Devellano was a name of an up-and-coming guy that could run a team. The Ilitches ended up interviewing Jimmy and then subsequently hiring him to be general manager. And I was close with Jimmy, so Jimmy asked me if I would go to the Red Wings, which I did. So we went from the penthouse to the outhouse, so to speak, because Detroit was down at the bottom of the standings. But I got to know the Ilitches quite well, and all the children of Mr. and Mrs. Ilitch, who are all, of course, grown and have their own kids now. Wonderful, wonderful people, treated me like gold the whole time I was there. I was there from 1982 to 1989. And in that time, we had some great fun years. We had some tough years. 1985, 86 comes to mind when we only had 40 points in Detroit. But luckily, I was GM of Adirondack Red Wings, and we won the Calder Cup that year, which sort of saved us a little bit because there was something to be happy about within the Red Wings. But very good people. When they bought the Detroit Red Wings in 1982, I think they had 300 Little Caesars pizza stores. And I think now they must have this isn't the right number, but I'm going to say like 3,000. That's how much they've grown. And of course, as you know, they bought the Tigers. Interesting factoid was when the Ilitches and Little Caesars Pizza owned the Detroit Red Wings, Domino's Pizza, their competitor, owned the Tigers at the same time. So that was really interesting in the city of Detroit. I can't tell you how much Mr. Ilitch, who's unfortunately has passed away now, loved the city of Detroit. Anything to do with the city of Detroit, to rebuilding it, to putting money into it, his own money into it. And Mrs. Ilitch is the same way, and so is Chris, who's sort of the heir apparent to Mr. Ilitch and now runs the empire for them. They all are huge Detroit natives, and fly the flag of the city of Detroit, which is really wonderful for the Detroit area. So I will tell you one other factoid in case anybody out there doesn't know this, and we want you to learn something every time you listen to this show. Mr. Ilitch, quietly and without any kind of notoriety about it, without telling anybody, Rosa Parks was robbed in her apartment in some year. I don't know what year it was. And from then on until the end of her life, Mr. Ilitch put her in an apartment and paid her rent the rest of her life to Rosa Parks. So that tells you right there something about the Ilitch family. Wonderful people. I look back with such fond memories of being with the Red Wings.
And his wife, Marion, only the 4th woman to have her name engraved on the Stanley Cup. And the first woman was Marguerite Norris of the Norris family that the Ilitches purchased the club from.
Right. Yeah. The great stories. The original 6, you can come up with all kinds of stories, but the Detroit Red Wings and the Ilitch family are very special.
This is our last show of 2024. We started with Wayne Gretzky on January 30th. And if there's a little bit of symmetry here, do you know how many shows we have done original content? And I know that on our panels, it will show that this is show 41, but including short shifts, our specials, the Ranger 5-part series, the show with Bernie Perron, playoff stuff. You know how many total original pieces of content we've done in this calendar year?
Go ahead. Let me hear it.
71. And to really bring this full circle, that's the number of the Red Wings captain, Dylan Larkin.
There you go. So what a bow you put on things, Vic.
Boy,
I got to tell you.
So with that, we're going to close the show. Special thanks to Max Bultman from The Athletic for joining us today. Thank you to our listeners. Our growth, our numbers continue to rise thanks to you. Send questions or comments to nhlwraparound@gmail.com. Remember, we are on all platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Amazon, iHeartRadio, Spotify, YouTube. Our complete catalog can be found on our website, nhlwraparound.com. So subscribe, like us, and also check out some of our shorter clips on X at NHL Wraparound. Also, our short shifts are on Wednesdays and Fridays with more immediate and in-depth coverage from around the NHL. And don't forget, we debut New York-centric next Monday, January 6th, 2025. Neil, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Vic.
Thanks for joining us on the NHL Wraparound podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on all the NHL action.